I titled this segment, How the Journey Began, a clear call to duty. In trying to understand anybody's story, especially anybody who had a successful life full of rewards, I think it's always good to understand where that person came from. And in this segment, Colonel White will give you an idea of his humble beginnings and that he's just another person like you or I who puts his shoes on in the morning, one shoe at a time. And he really just took life as a big journey, and he tried to do the right things, and he used his beginnings and his roots and his values that he learned when he was young, and he carried that through his entire life. I almost named this segment the prequel, because I think that prequels to great stories are always very interesting because everybody wants to know how things got started. I think that you have to watch this segment to give yourself context to anything else in this interview in order to get the proper context to the future segments. Because when you understand where somebody came from, that puts a lot more appreciation on where they ended up going.
Well, thank you, Dan. And likewise, you said you're glad to be here. I'm also honored that you would think about me to share some of my experiences and things that I've learned along the way. So background, grew up in Norcross, Georgia. Never really left the state of Georgia. I mean, I was just I wouldn't say a poor family, but we had our own struggles, kind of a little small farm community. Grew up, played all the sports at Norcross High School. In those days, Norcross was a very small town, unlike it is now. In fact, the high school, when I graduated in 1965, our claim to fame, we were the first class that had 3 digits. We graduated 100. So before that, it always very small classes. And so we had 4 sports, baseball, basketball, football, and track. So if you were able to stand up, you could make the team. So played all those sports, primarily football and track. It was my main sports. Grew up in an era, so I was born in 1947. So I grew up in an era that all the men in our community, relatives and so forth, had lived through the Depression. Our moms and dads had lived through the Depression. They had lived through World War II. And we came along where we were kind of cognizant of the Korean War, because we were little guys at that time, 5 and 6. So all our men, basically men that we looked up to, were all veterans or guys that had lived some pretty tough life, counting the Depression and World War II. And so those were the kind of role models I grew up around. From our parents to our relatives to our Sunday school teachers to our pastors to our coaches to our teachers, all had that same ilk. They were all about America, patriotism, and not necessarily did they go around talking about it a lot. It was just there. You knew what right looked like growing up. You know what right and wrong was about.
Yep.
And you knew that if you kind of stepped out of line, it wasn't necessarily your mom and dad corrected you. It could be anybody that knew about you or knew you or observed you. So my impression was your life's training model, if you will. You finished school, you worked, or you went to college, or you went in the military, and you did all of those, and not necessarily in that order. So I knew in kind of the life's training schedule, I was going to be eventually in the military at some point. I knew I wanted to finish it, get a degree. I knew I would eventually, of course, work and have a career. So it was just kind of taken for granted. One of the most life-changing things that happened to me was when I was 10 years old. And when that happened, and what this was about, we went to Norcross First Baptist Church. And I was 10 years old, and in that Sunday school class, there were maybe, 5 or 6 of us little 10-year-old boys. Our Sunday school teacher was a gentleman by the name of Thomas Johnson. And Thomas Johnson owned and ran the local hardware store, general store, if you will. I mean, you could buy everything from cow feed to screwdrivers, everything in the store.
Right.
Thomas Johnson was a World War II Marine. Anything Mr. Thomas Johnson said, we're going to listen. And he was very kind, very good man. I don't mean we respected his experience in the Marine Corps in World War II. Dan, I don't remember any Sunday school lessons. I'm ashamed to tell you. I don't remember any of my Sunday school teachers really too much, but I remember this one lesson and this one Sunday school teacher when I was 10 years old, Thomas Johnson.
He's the Marine, right?
He's the Marine. And there's, again, 5 or 6 of us little 10-year-old boys squirming around and trying to be good, but he's teaching our lesson. At the end of the lesson on this one Sunday, he said, boys, when you go home tonight, when you do your prayers, I want you to start adding 2 things to your prayers. We kind of sat up straight. This is, okay, this Marine's going to tell us something big, you know. And he said, I want you to start asking God for 2 things. And don't just do it one time. Do it from now on. We're listening hard now. Mm-hmm. He said, number 1, I want you to ask God that he will direct you to the right woman you are to marry. We're 10 years old. You know, girls, are you kidding? We kind of giggle and squirm around a little bit. We calm down. But okay, that was number 1. Pray for the lady, the woman that God would have you marry. After we kind of settled down after that one, he said, number 2, pray that God will direct you to your life's work. And he said, if God will direct you to your life's work, it'll be a calling, mm-hmm. and you'll never work a day in your life. That was a huge concept for a 10-year-old to absorb.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So he kind of went into more detail about both of those. He said, if you find that right woman to marry, and if you find that right calling, you'll have a wonderful life. Mm-hmm. Hey,
you were 10 years old, but because he said it,
yeah, I mean,
you knew it was important.
I'm 10 years old. I'm right. 10 years. I mean, that's huge concepts if you
right.
think about it.
Oh, yeah.
For a 10-year-old. But okay, I'm obedient. So that beginning that night, and from then on, I added those 2 requests to my prayers every night. The 1st Cavalry Division was formed out of Fort Benning, Georgia, and they deployed to Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And back in those days, hard to imagine now, but there were 3 television stations, and the news lasted 15 minutes each. Mm-hmm. So you did not have this 24/7 news, continual news going on. So it was 15 minutes a day and 3 television stations. So, and that came on, I think, like 6 o'clock at night. And not that I always caught the news, but in those days, because the 1st Cavalry Division had left out of Fort Benning, Georgia, to Vietnam, Georgia kind of claimed the 1st Cavalry Division as the Georgia Division. Mm-hmm. Well, if you'll recall, there's a movie called We Were Soldiers, mm-hmm. and there's a book called We Were Soldiers Once and Young. Mm-hmm. And Hal Moore at the time was a lieutenant colonel. And the Battle of LZ X-ray happened. And it was the biggest battle to that point. You can imagine, now that this quote, Georgia Division, mm-hmm. this 15 minutes of news at night, and that was what the focus was in the fall of 1965. And I had started having this tremendous, I knew I was going to go in the military at one point, mm-hmm. but I had this tremendous calling or almost a guilt feeling. I went to the Army recruiter in March of 1966, and I walked in, and it was crickets. I mean, nobody's lining up to go in the military. I mean, right. It's very quiet. And I walked into the recruiting station downtown Atlanta, and the sergeant said, "May I help you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "I said I want to become a paratrooper. I want to."
So it wasn't like World War II where they were flooding in to sign up.
No.
It was like
no. I mean, of course, the draft was going on.
Right.
So you either volunteered or got drafted, or you were physically unable. Which it was kind of, you're either going to go in voluntarily, be drafted, or you're not physically able, whatever.
Got it, yeah.
And I said, I want to join the United States Army. I want to be an infantry paratrooper, which in my mind, that was kind of the toughest thing you could do. Mm-hmm. And okay. A few days later, I'm on a bus to Fort Benning, Georgia to go to basic training. And I had no intention. I just was going to be a soldier, serve my time, go to Vietnam. I just felt that calling. That's what I was supposed to have done. Because as you recall in my early remarks, my role models had been World War II veterans. All those men that I grew up around and was impressed by and looked upon as leaders, they had served their country in combat in World War II. And I'm a was a product of that. So I'm on the bus, I go to Fort Benning, and I will tell you, and I'll tell you straight up, the first night I laid on a bunk in an Army barracks in Fort Benning, Georgia, I knew that's where I was supposed to be. I knew I was supposed to be in the Army. Our class got there pretty much in the Tet Offensive of 1968. Mm-hmm. Of those 169 young men, about 10% were killed right away. And I don't know what the percentage were wounded. And of that 169, and now I'll fast forward a little bit, a few of us made a career. Some of the other guys had some prior service, so they stayed in the Army to get their 20 years or whatever. And of the 169, there were 3 of us that stayed in and made colonel. I was one, and there was 2 other guys. I was the youngest in the class. This has to do with leadership, by the way. Mm-hmm. I was the youngest in the class. The other groups, I mean, there were about 5 or 6 of us that were not college graduates. I was not a college graduate. And the others were either college graduates or they had been sergeants in the Army, and now they're at OCS, and they're older, more experienced. Mm-hmm. So I am the youngest guy in the class. Mm-hmm. I am not a college graduate. I am not a former sergeant, and I'm off to Vietnam.